I want to start by telling you a story that is far away from what feels like big data technology and the problems of the day. I want to start by telling you the story of paper. Paper was invented by China in the 1st century AD. It is one of the 4 great inventions of China, along with printing, gunpowder, and the compass. Some guy in 105 AD was able to make paper out of essentially very basic and generic wood and rags. What did this change? It changed everything. Before that, paper was reserved for administrations. It was an expensive material, an expensive technology that was used by administrations to send orders across and coordinate government activity. After paper became cheap, suddenly you could be drunk, destitute, and still have paper in the forest and write your poetry. And it turns out that one of the greatest poets of the Tang Dynasty actually turned out to be started as this drunk, destitute guy in the forest and wrote some of the most incredible poetry that is read to this day. What's extraordinary is that within a few centuries, you had the first extraordinary cultural flourishment in China. And it was a very difficult invention to reproduce. All kinds of cultures, of course, were interacting with China around this, saw paper, tried to reproduce it, and China was extremely protective of the secret, and were not able to do so. And it was one of the great export products of China. And we're able to get some knowledge transfer, and acquire the technology and know-how on making paper. They took it back, and there was an incredible paper industry that started in Baghdad, and they were able to make innovations of making thicker paper where you could write on both sides. And shortly after that, within a few centuries, you had incredible cultural flourishment in the Islamic Empire. Paper reached Europe through the Islamic Empire, with the Islamic conquests of Spain and southern Italy. And essentially, it reached Europe in a massive way only around 1400. Paper became readily available in Europe only around 1400. But essentially, paper was perhaps the most defining technology of our history. The original use case was extremely limited, just like when you think of how people used the telephone at the beginning. You know, what is the guy supposed to do with the first telephone? Apparently, it was used when building skyscrapers to be able to coordinate the architect who was at the bottom with the construction teams who were at the top. And they just kept the lines later on so that you could communicate within the skyscrapers, and then they connected the skyscrapers so that you could have local telephone rings. Cheap paper enabled new content and uses which were absolutely inconceivable when it was first invented. Right? It enabled a postal system, it enabled toilet paper, it enabled paper money, right? It enabled scientific correspondence. When you look at how science was done in Europe for centuries, it was through people writing letters to each other. Literacy, schools, libraries, essentially the whole foundation of knowledge as we know it was built upon this technology. Paper was the first technology that enabled peer-to-peer communication with high bandwidth. This was the super big data technology of the time, and it unleashed inconceivable creativity. And I think we are in a similar stage, right? We're we are currently unleashing things that we cannot conceive, and it's continuing. Nobody thought that something like Wikipedia could exist a few years ago. Nobody thought that something like Facebook would make sense a few years ago. I do believe that the job I've practiced has a creative aspect to it. And if I'm analyzing what unleashes creativity, what enables creativity, what is it? It's the fact that I can try something easily. That somehow if there's something new, it does not force me to try to build everything from scratch. So you have to be able to try something easily, right? You have to be able to start with very little cost. Because the more money has to be put up front to start an effort, to start a new idea, the more you're going to want guarantees of its success. And guarantees of success is going straight, fully against creativity. So there is no reason why any of us should expect a higher hit rate if we are really trying something new. You have to be allowed to fail fast with no residual cost. Somehow, if you had to pay $1 million to start something and you have to keep paying that debt, that's a problem, right? And if it works, you have to be able to share this information, share that it has worked, and grow with it extremely quickly. Creativity is about enabling the talent you don't even suspect. You have no idea who has that talent, and maybe they don't even know they have this talent. Right? If the person who's going to do it does not even know they have this talent, if the product that's going to be built or the idea that's going to be implemented cannot be even imagined or planned for, it's about essentially allowing an environment that invites this sort of thinking. So it requires technology. I argue that it requires a lot of technology to just make it easier to start things. It requires talent, of course. But it requires also a very receptive environment. Because there is a problem with failure. Usually, failure is noticed, right? And failure is not good. If you don't have experimental variation, you really don't know anything. As a data miner, it's the most despairing thing to hear when I go to a customer who basically says, I only keep in my data the positive cases, right? Like, okay, you want me to do an analysis on churn, on about who are your customers who are likely to leave. Great. First thing I ask is give me a sample of customers who stay with you and give me a sample of customers who have gone. One of them actually answered, straight-faced, oh, but we delete the data of the customers who are gone. What I do is I drive contrast between positive and negative, and I figure out what seems to be important in separating those two populations. If you don't give me the negative cases, I cannot do anything for you. You need experimental variation where there are positive cases and negative cases. This has deep consequences in how you organize your organization. Some people are going to try variations which will fail. They will have to be honest about this if this failure is going to be useful. That data needs to be actually recorded, collected, understood, analyzed, visible. And it must not be embarrassing. If you get fired because you are part of a failed experiment, then you are never going to produce the cultural environment, the corporate culture that enables this kind of creativity. The failure and success can both be overinterpreted. Everything can be the cause of failure. It could be the color of my scarf, it could be the brand of my shoes, and it could be the way I thought about the problem. And same thing about success. You have to make sure you're not fooled by data. Data can be so easily overinterpreted. Data analysis is delicate, is fraught with mistakes. Right? It needs to be checked, rechecked. You need several people to work on it because working with Judy and Duncan was always incredible, where one of us would always notice horrible, monstrous mistakes that the other made. And somehow the result was good at the end. But it took several minds to be at this and make sure that there was not horrible results. And you have to be prepared for failures. If you only try what others have done successfully, I can guarantee one thing to you, but only one, is that you will systematically be behind the others. There is no way you can innovate with this attitude. What's the big deal about big data? The big deal is that over the past 30 years, for every 5 years, the cost of data storage, essentially spinning disks, has basically gone down by an order of magnitude every 5 years. In anything, in science, in organization, in whatever, we say that every order of magnitude basically breaks the seams of however you think of the world and however you organize yourself. Right? I'm trying to build a team of people right now. There are 5. I imagine what it would be like if there were 50. It's not the same job. Right? Imagine you multiply by 10 the audience here. The technology we use couldn't be the same. The internet, started in the 80s, fine. But the real takeoff of internet started with Windows 95, Netscape, and Windows Explorer in 1995. Since then, people have built bandwidth capacity in massive amounts. Every 5 years, bandwidth capacity has multiplied by 10. Today, we all had to be reminded to turn off our cell phones because by default, we always keep them on and we always have them with us. So we're always available. If we're comparing the two worlds of before big data and after big data, I don't know when that separation happened, but here's sort of the difference. Before, storage was expensive. Now it's cheap. Processing capacity, computers that were fast, were expensive. Now they're boring commodities, like buying fuel. Software, you had to go to a store or you had to go to a physical vendor and actually buy the software before you could use it. It was expensive because usually that person was IBM. Now software is open source. You just download it. You try it. Before you had to go to retail distribution, right? And the new releases essentially was a whole new release campaign. Now it's internet download distribution. Before you had to have your own data center. When you wanted to do anything with data, you basically had to open up your basement and have all kinds of computers and servers in there and bandwidth access. And now you don't care about that. It's all in the cloud. It was very capital intensive before. You had to put a lot of money on the table to be able to start anything with data. Now it's all operational cost. So what does this mean? We're all connected all the time. This was not the case, right? If you look at movies from the 70s, people didn't have computers on their desktop. Now data is very easy to capture. Data is easy to transmit and cheap to store. The infrastructure that you need for all this works very well together. It's cheap, it's immediately deployable, and immediately scalable. What big data means in terms of when you think of telephone data, right? The very raw element that you could use, right, is bill amounts per customer. And you can already learn a few things by that. This is essentially 4 bytes per customer per month, right? And you can basically figure out what is the segmentation in terms of value of your customers and which people are valuable, which people are less valuable, things like this. But you really have no detail. Big data is also about varied data. You can have all kinds of, the problem, one of the issues with big data is that the data doesn't look structured anymore. Before you had prices, and you had product IDs, and you had customer IDs, and you had dates, stuff that looks, you can expect what it looks like. But what's a blog entry? What's a comment? What's a tweet? What's an image? What's a video? How do you analyze that? How do you search images? How do you search videos? How do you add new things? The next new social site suddenly becomes a new data source. How do you integrate that? In terms of big data and creativity, for me what really matters is make your technology infrastructure. Now, technology is there, but the way you organize your technology is not standard. And you have to be careful about this, and you have to make sure it actually enables the right things, right? You have to make it easy to start new ideas, right? The big problem is allowing people to start something new without going through months of red tape or months of difficulties or a lot of learning new technology. The technology has to help them rather than drag them. Make it safe to fail, otherwise no one will try anything. That is perhaps the most important message that I try to give to customers and I try to remind myself. When you try something new at a very small scale, Tangent and MongoDB, what the Tangent publishes, is a database, an operational database, that can run on my laptop, and the same technology can run on 1,000 servers in the cloud. It will be the same program. It's this kind of enablement which is critical. If something works, you can deploy it without rewriting everything from scratch. Thank you.